when we came up with the various topics for the year, and we knew NIMBYism and YIMBYism is kind of a hot and growing topic, we're in a time of growth, and NIMBYism especially is always something that really emerges during times of fast-paced growth, because it's hard. And so I really wanted to do this particular topic to share really my perspective that I've developed over the years. My personal history really is starting as a citizen, doing this work, kind of evolving into this over time. And now I've been with Idaho Smart Growth for 11 years, but I still am on my neighborhood association board, and I've served on that board since 1999. Lived in the valley since '82 and have seen a lot of change. Guys, any of those of you who have lived here are on, I'm sure have seen it as well. I just want to talk about my presentation a little bit. This is online, so not as much of a conversation as I would like to have, but I'm going to keep it probably a little shorter than an hour so we can have that conversation. And hopefully, if any people join us online, I'm going to watch that. And if nobody does, I'll probably jump out of that online presentation model. Because I think this really deserves a conversation and a dialogue in our community and ongoing. This picture I put on here, most of the pictures I put on this PowerPoint really are just kind of my personal pictures. Some of them illustrate some of the content, but I just happen to love this picture. I use it for mostly for when I'm talking about complete streets and how to create a place in community. It's obviously not even in this country, but I think a very identifiable location that any of us can look at and think, you know, that might be a fun place. So I'm not going to talk about NIMBYism or YIMBYism specifically directly a lot today. What I'm really going to talk about, how do we be effective as advocates, whether you're just your citizen, your planner who's working for a city or some other agency. At the end of the day, we're all advocates, or all should be advocates for good and positive growth for our communities. So I'm going to start with smart growth, because we believe that smart growth is positive growth and is good growth. For those of you who may not be really familiar with our organization and or the National Smart Growth Movement, these are 10 principles that were founded by that movement, probably 20, 25 years ago. They're really broad. Some people find them kind of vague. They've evolved and changed over time, but they're very intentionally broad, because smart growth is not a thing. It can be many things depending upon where you are. It's very contextual. Smart growth in a Cascade, Idaho versus a Nampa is not the same thing. It's not the same community. It doesn't have the same purposes and goals, other than everybody wants a few of the same things. So this is where we start when we're looking for, what does positive growth look like? And to us, it looks like trying to fulfill these 10 principles and trying to achieve them. And really, at the end of the day, it's about creating great places to live. We all want a great place to live, but what does that mean? It means many things to different people. And I just threw kind of some of the more frequently used terminology today, currently, about what creates great places to live. First and foremost, we're beginning to, and I'll get into this a little more later, but we're beginning to realize that, community is about people, first and foremost. So whatever we do, we need to be thinking at what we call a human scale. What do people want? What do people need? How do we provide those and serve that? Choices. Choices in jobs, choices in places to live, choices in how we get around. A lot of choice is, the more choice the community has, probably the nicer a place it is to live. Healthy. Increasingly, we're all realizing, we want healthy places to live. We want healthy water, we want clean air, we want to be healthy, we want to be able to be active. We want economic vibrancy, and that's a part of health in the community from a community level. Livable means a lot of different things, so a lot of people, it's kind of becoming a tired term. Some people don't like using it anymore. I like to include it here because people still talk about it, and again, it's very personal. What's a livable place to me is probably not the same to many of you in the room. There's probably some overlap though. Sustainable is a new term that's kind of emerging more and more because communities are realizing we're moving into a world where, you know, things may not be as certain as they once were. We're not really sure how much longer we, you know, have enough water to keep growing our crops and provide fresh drinking water. What's that look like 50, 100 years from now? We're not sure about our climate. Is it going to be changing? What does that look like? So what does sustainable mean, and how does a community look at that? Affordable, obviously, for those of us, some people that's not an issue, anything's affordable, but increasingly many people find affordability a challenge. And then a sense of place, which is kind of why I used that photo in the first slide. Just all of us want a place. We want to be someplace that feels comfortable and like home. And we talked about working on the Eagle Comp Plan together, and I really enjoyed, I've worked on 3 of them now, but the last one was so fun because one of the things that emerged and that the city ended up using was somewhat planner driven, but I felt like it really came from the community, and they used home as their identifier for the whole process and created, turned it into an acronym, the HOME, all meant meaning. But I just really like that because at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. When we talk about our communities, we're talking about our homes. So what does this mean to you? And I think where I want to drill down tonight is when change is coming, we tend to not think about the big picture. We tend to start with ourselves. You know, what is this? How is it going to impact me? What don't I like about this? We tend to start there. We rarely start with what do I like about this? What does this change mean for my neighborhood? I could have written probably dozens of these questions, but these are just a few I threw out there. What I want to help us think about tonight is, as much as we need to and want to and are going to think about ourselves and our immediate preferences, we really need to keep also track of the big picture because we live in that big picture. And so I'm repeating those things that are kind of the bigger picture. And how do we really get to that big picture? Sometimes the choices that we want personally may not always get to the big picture, and that's part of what I'm hoping to impact tonight. This is another way to think about positive growth or smart growth, and this is where we work as an organization. It's really the integration of these 3 aspects of community, and that's your land use, your transportation, and then your community. Community means a lot of things. It means your culture, your arts and history, your engagement, and what your community wants. So I really like to take those principles that are kind of big and high level and drill them down to what I call a lot simpler way to view them. Because this really begins to, I think, force you to think about is a particular change that's coming or a particular growth impact that's being proposed. Is it doing these? And maybe for those of you in the room, and later on we can discuss that, do we even agree with these? But we talk about them in terms of the 5 Ds. And one of the Ds that I have right at the top is density, which is, we sometimes call it a 4-letter word in the smart growth world. A lot of people struggle with it, don't necessarily like it. But the 3 things under it are what are important. And density can mean many different things in many different places. But it always means these 3 things. It's compact. And in one community that might mean, 4 houses per acre instead of 2. In another community it might mean a high-rise apartment that's got how many units in it. But it's compact, and it's compact for the location that it's in. And it directly relates to this last one, preserves farmland. I could have said open space, just anything we want to preserve or we don't want to build. And that compactness, so that density is how we achieve that, especially in a growing environment. And then infill is one of those challenges of what does it mean and where do you put it? And that goes back to one of the principles of growing into the community. You know, are you absorbing your growth rather than spreading your growth out? So infill, some people question what that really means. My personal definition is if you've got growth pretty much on every side, even if it's maybe acres, it's probably really infill. And I have an example here. Diversity gets that choice. The way we get diversity, the way we get choice is through diversity. The way we get affordability is through diversity. And mixed use always creates more diversity than single uses of a land type. Design is really how you make all of these things work and fit together. You know, do you design your transportation system well? Is the building design context sensitive? You know, maybe it's taller than everything else around it, but I tell you, a tall building can sometimes fit in well, providing it's not too outside the box of what's around it, if it's designed well. And is the design compatible? So maybe you're in a historic neighborhood and somebody's built a very modern looking building, modern home. This happened in my neighborhood, and it's what prompted us to create a historic district, because I do live in a historic neighborhood. And the home itself was a beautiful piece of architecture, but it's just so out of place that the neighborhood, we didn't like it. It doesn't fit. It really changed how our neighborhood felt. And it didn't do anything else positive. It didn't add any more units or anything like that. So it was just a different house. And then destination and distance, and these are two of my favorite things that I think we always really need to keep in mind when we're looking at growth and thinking about growth and whether it's what it's doing that's good and what it's doing that maybe we aren't as happy about. Destination and distance. We're increasingly in a world where people want to walk and bike more, want to be able to ride a bus some of the time. That's pretty challenging here. But particularly walk. I like to focus on walk, because all of us like to walk a little bit. We may not want to walk to work, but we may want to walk to a friend's house, or we may want to walk to church, or we may want our kids to be able to walk to the park or to school. And we really have created land use patterns and decisions and transportation networks that don't serve this choice very well. And that's what I'm going to talk about real briefly here. Some of you have seen this before. I've presented a lot in a lot of different contexts, but I like to use it again because it's just such a clear, good image of. So on the bottom you have, you know, kind of how for decades we basically built our communities. Close? Not close enough?
You tend to talk that way.
Oh, okay.
Makes it sound kind of funny.
Okay. And you know, it worked forever, for a long, long time. And then we, for a variety of reasons, sometime in the 50s, started getting creative and decided maybe it didn't work so well. And we started developing what is on the top half of this. And many of us recognize this today. It's many of our communities, and we're still building many communities like this today. We're beginning to try and shift away from it. And it's not necessarily about going back to what we did, but how to reinvent something that serves us as well as what we did. And if you really look at the differences here, so the little red building, we're going to make it a school here. It can be anything you want, but it's supposed to be a school. So if you just think about that school and focus on that school in the lower, and think about all those little dots that are houses, and all the people and some houses with children, and how many of them can actually walk to that school. And especially if that infrastructure, the streets have sidewalks and they're safe and comfortable. And then you look at the one at the top, and that neighborhood might be really walkable. You might be able to walk around there all day and enjoy yourself, but your kid is not walking to that school unless you're comfortable letting them get out on that obviously fairly big major road. And it's also pretty far from many of those homes. And then over on the other side, the little purple buildings, those are places of work. So it's kind of the same thing. Can anybody really want to, or will they even try to walk to those places of work? So this is kind of what we've done. You know, we have created these separated, and what we're now finally coming to realize kind of an inefficient and unsustainable urban form. So smart growth and positive growth challenges us to become efficient again and sustainable again. And what does that look like? So I'm going to use this example. This is, anybody know where this is? Anybody recognize this? Somebody must. Somebody must.
I know it's West Boys.
Huh?
It's Harris Ranch.
It is Harris Ranch. I like to use Harris Ranch as an example only because, well, for a variety of reasons, but because I'm very, very familiar with it. I was president of my neighborhood association for round 2 on Harris Ranch. Some of you may or may know round 2. I went through round 1 and round 2, which were quite different. So Harris Ranch, how many of you have been there? How many of you more or less like it? How many of you could maybe see yourself living there? Affordability aside. So it was a really amazing project that really tried to create a whole new community, neighborhood in that part of town, and frankly, it has been quite successful. And there's elements people could debate back and forth, but they do have choice, even though because it's Boise, and right now Boise is fundamentally not very affordable for many people. In the context of Boise, it does have a fair amount of choice. You've got large, you've got small, you've got apartments finally coming in, which is always one of my grievances, is we need more rentals, and that's another conversation we can have. And there's people who aren't happy with certain things about it. There's people who aren't happy about the foothills, but for those of you who may not know, the original plan ate up the entire foothills out there. And there was going to be 360 homes in the foothills alone, and 2 very long roads that went all the way almost to the ridge. So that was a compromise. I call that a compromise for those of us who may be passionate about not having anything like foothills. There's a lot of nice green open space, and connectivity is pretty good. They're slowly, and this is always the case. You need rooftops before you can get commercial, but they are finally getting their commercial. There will be there's a middle school out there, and there will be a new grade school fairly soon. Fire department, there's a lot of, it's a real mixed, pretty whole engaged area. So what does it take to achieve this? My go-to, and I usually am talking to professionals and challenging them to engage and be more engaged and engage community, because we don't do that well professionally. We aren't well trained to and to trust the community. I call it upside down planning, where you kind of start with the community and ask them what they think and what they want. And it's hard. It takes time, and it's hard, and you have to trust a little bit. But I'm here today to challenge us, the citizens, to do that, to realize that engaged community participation really is the answer, in my opinion, the main answer to good growth, to understanding and knowing. So how do we do that? It's not easy, especially when you're just a citizen. You're doing it on your own time. No one's paying you to do it. You're not an expert. So how can you, as an individual, how can I influence positive growth? So there's a couple of things on your table that I wanted to throw out. I've got little pictures of them here. How many of you went to the last Boise community conversation? So you'll recognize these. So that community conversation was, one of the things they did was they laid out 3 growth scenarios. Excuse me, 3 scenarios for development and what it looked like and what type. And it was just a great way to kind of talk about those bigger issues of growth and the challenges of growth. But I really think that these 4 things are what help us become good advocates. You can't become an expert, but you should understand some of the basics. And we've got some tools in the room here. Our citizen's guide has some basics, tries to cover the basics, as well as one can in a large topic with a tiny little short pamphlet. But it does a pretty good job. And then it's way too much to think you're going to impact it all. It's just it's big. I mean, I work at this realm and I work in niches. You just can't. I mean, those of you in the room who work this, Eric works in affordable housing. That even housing alone is big. So figure out where you want to work, how you want to work, what you're most passionate about. And then follow through. I know a lot of people, I talk to citizens over the time, they'll get really involved in, for instance, the Eagle Comp Plan or the Boise City Comp Plan. You go and you get involved in a big, high-level planning, communities in motion. And then that's it, and you're done. And that's great. Good for you that you did that, because many, many don't even do that. And I think, unfortunately, there's a gap in where we invite people in. The next step is really as important. You've now created the direction, but over time, different leaders come and go, different staff come and go, and you really need to stay at the table. You need to be the ones who monitor that comp plan. Is the city really doing what they said what the community said they wanted them to do? You're the ones who really need to monitor communities in motion. Because that's really the voices that those decision makers and staff constantly need to hear from, and help correct it and adjust it as they move along. And then ask the right questions. And so I'll go through each of these. So here's, just some of the basics. Our first year with the Citizens Planning Academy was really focused around this. We actually went through a whole session on LUPA, which is the Land Use Planning Act. It's state statute. It's kind of a high level, what guides planning in this state. I'm not suggesting that you become an expert on LUPA, but just knowing that it exists and learning fundamentally a little bit about what it does and doesn't do. Area of impact. How many people know what that is or what that even means? A few. So area of impact is a language you'll find in LUPA, but area of impact is something that we have created in this state as the tool for cities to decide how their growth further on. So all of our cities in this valley, most of them in the state, although not all of them, have the ideal area of impact is you've looked out 20 years and you've decided very realistically what your growth is. And I'm saying that because some of the area of impacts, they're kind of all over the map in the state. I don't necessarily agree with all of them. But the well-done ones have really looked hard at where are we going to grow, where do we want to grow, where can we provide services, because that's really important. Can we provide sewer? Can we provide water? Can we provide transportation? Because those are things that are essential to having a community. So that's what your area of impact is, and if you've probably heard it if you've ever attended any planning thing. So every city has an area of impact, and every comprehensive plan includes that map that shows the area of impact. What that means is the county knows, you as a citizen should know, that means that city intends to annex and incorporate that area sometime in the next 20 years. It's not quite that straight away. A lot of people don't know, I think many of you in this room do, we're in a unique situation in Ada County, but it's really important to understand that the Ada County Highway District is who owns and operates nearly all of our roads. There's a handful of private roads, and then you have some state-owned and operated roads. But outside of that, they own and operate our roads. And really your city's role, other than to give up some of their property taxes so you can run, your city's role is purely advisory. And they have influence to the extent that those two entities work well together. So the last point is really the most important. So I know a lot of challenge right now, and some of this tension has been growing in the last few years again. It's the third time I've lived through this growth tension in our valley with these high, rapid growth rates. This projection, and some people challenge it, I don't. I've been involved with the committee that actually creates this projection. I'm not anymore, but it's a committee at Compass. They're the Demographic Advisory Committee. They're a mixture of real tech geeky types and then people like me. But it's a very scientific process. And I've watched this number for over 20 years now. And I can tell you, it's about as real as a number gets. We're going to be over 1 million people somewhere within the range of 2040. It happens sooner, it might take till 2045. I mean, so these demographic and these projections, they're moving dots a little bit. They're not as precise as they might be on a piece of paper. And they review them every year, and they've adjusted them over time. But this fundamentally has been the projection in this valley since as long as I've lived here, and it really hasn't changed. So this is why we need to talk about this. We are going to grow. And we can talk later about that. Some people would just like to stuff it. And so with people also come jobs, hopefully. We will grow, the jobs will come, is essential. So the reason I throw the job number in there as well as the people number is that's another type of growth. Those jobs need places to be, they need certain kinds of infrastructure to function and be successful businesses. So going way back to the very beginning when I talked about your niche. So in that big picture, you know, I think it helps people. I think for me it's been helpful over my time of being an advocate, and I've seen effective advocates and ineffective ones. And generally the effective ones are people who figure out what they really care about, what they're passionate about. And they work there, and they learn that area, that little area. So is it transportation? I mean, that's huge, and that could be many things. Inside of transportation, some people, it's about wanting more buses. Some people, it's about walking. Some people, it's about biking. Some people, it's about congestion in their cars. So this is, again, I could have put many different things down. Creating this was kind of a challenge. But just in general, these are some high level. If transportation is what concerns you, here's some things you should consider and you should be focused on and thinking about. Anybody have suggestions I missed that they'd like to add to transportation? So another personal focus of many people is preservation of open space and farmland. Those are actually kind of different. How you preserve them, they can be very different. There's sometimes tensions even between farmland, working land, what we call working lands, and just open space. It's kind of set aside for animals and plants and us to make recreate. But in my opinion, the most challenging thing here is this growth and this land use pattern that we talked about. And one of the best tools that is very underutilized. So communities in motion, how many of you know what communities in motion is? Used it, looked at it. We call it SIM. I like to put that in for people who may hear SIM. So this is our long-range transportation plan for Ada and Canyon counties. COMPAS, which is our metropolitan planning organization, creates it. And they redo it every 4 years. That's coming up again soon. And they invite people to come and participate in creating it. And in 2004, up until then, it had always just been literally a transportation plan. In 2004, there have been a lot of conversations building up to that, where everybody realized, you know, transportation doesn't live in isolation. It's connected to land use. And I don't know if you remember my little 3 bubbles that I had earlier on in the presentation. But those two, land use and transportation, they work together or not sometimes. So they worked really hard, and for the first time in 2004, created what we now call communities in motion. And they changed the name. Before that, it was just always called the Long Range Transportation Plan. It always is looking 20 years out. And they have, COMPAS is a huge resource. They have an enormous amount of data. What I think is important about communities in motion is that it is a document that's advisory only. And all of the agencies in the Valley can live under it as carefully as they choose or as loosely as they choose. And so one of the things that I encourage citizens to do is to learn it well enough to be able to make sure that your community's comprehensive plan is actually following community's emotion. And to make sure that DRT's plans is actually following community's emotion. And to make sure that ACHD's plans are actually following community's emotion. And what I mean by that is there's all this data that we spent where we identify where we want to protect and preserve farmland, where we want to grow houses. And there's an annual report that shows how well we're doing or not doing in terms of following that. So why I think it's important is we're a region. And what Eagle does is going to impact Boise, and what CUNA does is going to impact Meridian, and what Caldwell does. I mean, we're just a region, and we're all crisscrossing all over the region all the time. People live one place, work another place, have friends who live in different communities. So we're really a region, and we're not going to achieve those principles, I believe, in isolation. I believe they have to be achieved regionally at this point for us, because we're really growing together as a region. And it's sort of like, if you think of an amoeba or something, it's sort of like if you scrunch it in one place, it's going to pop out somewhere else. So that's how I think of it and why I think it's important. So maybe it's your neighborhood, and your neighborhood's a great way to be involved. The City of Boise, for those of you who don't live here, we have something called neighborhood associations, but other communities have all kinds of community groups. I don't think I really, need to go on and on about this, but it's a nice, understandable. It's where a lot of people focus. It's where we care. It's often where our heart is, and the place where you already are knowledgeable. You know your neighborhood better than anybody, and don't let any planner tell you otherwise. So your personal focus can be many things, and I didn't want to create this list, but some people just care about really creating communities. Some people care about placemaking. Affordable housing, we had a huge turnout at our session last month that was around affordable housing. It's a huge problem right now. I put stopping growth at the end because that's what some people's focus is right now. I hear it all the time. How do we just stop it? It's just, I don't like it. It's changing. So I created a little bit of a conversation around this. So if that's your personal focus, I would challenge you to change it. First, I would challenge you to think about why you don't like growth. Really think hard. What is it that's bothering you about it? Some of it is just change. Humans in general, we don't like change. We're not really comfortable with it. But it's really important to understand we are changing, and we're going to change, and things are going to change. And what drove me to this work is a real belief that you can resist change, or you can help mold it and shape it and make it something positive. And I believe that's much more productive, and that's what I believe to be effective advocacy is to be aware of the fact that you can resist it all you want, like it's been happening forever, as long as, among humans anyway, as long as we sit up and started walking. So change is just real. It's happening, it's coming. In our case, growth is coming. There really is no good way to stop growth. And actually, the way you stop growth, and we have communities in Idaho and all over this country who have effectively stopped growth, and they're shrinking. And what creates that is an unsuccessful community. That's how you stop growth. You have an unsuccessful community, which none of us want. None of us want an unsuccessful community. So once you understand that, and you then move towards, okay, I'm willing to manage growth, I'm willing to influence it, I'm willing to get involved with the molding and the shaping of it. Then you think about these different scenarios and go back to picking your focus and putting your energy in. I'm almost done here. I just really want to talk a little bit about tactics and strategy. There's a lot of different approaches. I believe there's times for all of them. So pushing and pulling is another way to talk about, really making a fuss, really making a loud noise, really challenging and fighting a particular something. And there are times to do that. There are times that is what needs to be done. But just make sure you really know it's the right time, because it's not effective. None of these strategies are effective if it's the wrong time to use it. There's times to cooperate. Harris Ranch is a great example of a time and a place to cooperate, and it's the result of an enormous amount of cooperation and support by all the participants at the end of the day. There's times to participate, going to help create your community, your city's comprehensive plan. You'll learn a lot, you'll learn more about how your community ticks, because you'll realize that there's different perspectives about everything in the community. Which comes to the last one, which is compromise. We thankfully live in a democracy, and I believe democracy is messy and cluttered and cumbersome and absolutely necessary. But it requires compromise. It just does. We live in a community and we don't all think the same, we don't all agree on much of anything, but we can work together. And we can achieve really great things together if we're willing to compromise and participate and cooperate. And occasionally scream and yell when we have to. But this last point is, I believe there's never a good time to just react. And I think a lot of the energy we're experiencing right now in our community is just that. We're fearful of the change, they don't like it, they don't see the community they grew up in, and they're just reacting to it. So if you find yourself in a place of reaction, here's some questions I encourage you to think about. Why are you really reacting? What are you reacting to? Is it just, are you just sad? Are you just feeling, reminiscent of the past? And those are legitimate. Those are all legitimate feelings, but they're not productive, they're not effective basis for being an advocate. And then move on to these other, who is it you're trying to influence? What is the outcome you're looking for? Are the people you can work with? And I added a couple of pieces under that. I'm a real believer in not assuming the other stakeholders at the table have an agenda. The minute you assume someone before you start working with them has an agenda is the minute you cannot work with them. And citizens are most guilty, in my experience, of assuming developers have an agenda. Developers do have an agenda. It's their living, it's their livelihood, it's what they do. So yeah, they want to make money. If they're not in it for making money, they're not going to be there. But it's not the only thing they're there for. And developers are all over the map. And some of them are fantastic, and some of them want to always do the right thing and really want to work with you. And some of them maybe not so much. But you can't know that until you're willing to sit down and talk to them. Same with your neighbor. Maybe your neighbor and you really disagree on something. But, again, getting to cooperation and how do I compromise, where is the compromise? I used to talk to neighborhood associations a lot and work with them on how to become more effective. And one of my main things I always pose is to start with, what can I affect? So lots of times people want to jump up and down and scream and yell about more traffic when you're putting in 60 houses. Well, chances are that's a non-starter. Chances are the transportation plans and all the modeling tells the people who make these decisions that even though you don't want those houses there and you don't want those few more cars on your road, there's plenty of room for them. So you can't affect that. So it's a non-starter. It's not a useful argument. So really thinking about I just realized I have something wrong. I thought I got a So really thinking about these last two, getting all the way to NIMBYism versus YIMBYism, is that sometimes the not in my backyard has really negative consequences that we're not thinking about. You know, you don't want to see that last remnant of farmland go that's been there forever. But is it really infill? And if those houses don't go there, where are they going to go? Because they're going somewhere. Are they going to go out to even a worse place and start a bad land use pattern in an agricultural area that isn't yet surrounded by houses? Are they going to, you know, go up into the foothills where maybe you don't want them? So, you know, really thinking big picture when you think about your preferences. What's the outcome of them? And then the effectiveness and what kind of effect. You know, think about your outcomes. What are they? What do you really want? And is the approach you're taking and the actions you're taking something that in fact will really be successful? And that's that. What kind of effect? So who decides what a great place to live is? And I always believe it's the community. And if we achieve these 4 things, 5 things, will we be successful in creating a great place to live? So this is my challenge to everybody at the end. It's really hard and messy, but I think we can do a lot better trying to work together. NIMBYism to me is a non-starter. Automatic decision, not cooperative, and you're not willing to work. YIMBYism even has its challenges in times and places. Sometimes it's also only thinking short term, although it tends to be a little more complicated. And with that, I'm going to close my part of this. And I was going to try and create a resource page because there's so many resources out there, and it was like, where do you stop? So I gave you my contact information. I gave you our website. There's some data on the table. I can send you to all kinds of resources depending on what you're looking for and what you're interested in. We do that all the time. We like to try and be a resource to citizens and help them be more effective. So we hope you'll reach out to us. And one of the things you can do is continue coming to our Citizens Planning Academy and learn more. Next month is going to be Amanda Ashley, who's a professor over at BSU on placemaking. So that should be really fun and interesting. And I also just remember one of the projects that we're going to be working on with Yacht actually this year is planning for wildland for wildfire in the wildland urban interface, which is a growing problem obviously all over the West. And there is a conference or a symposium, I guess, that's coming up, fairly technical, I think, but anyone's invited to it. And I have this one little handout. So rather than do that, I was going to give you a website, which is www.uidaho, so it's University of Idaho, .edu. Well, you know what, I'm just going to let you go there and look for the symposium on that, because it's a really long one. Or you can call me and I can send you the link to this. It's in October, it's October 19th, it's here in Boise. And it's about the law and this topic. So it's law, planning, and wildfire in the wildland urban interface. So that's, if you're interested in wildfire, that's another niche. It's a growing niche. You can get involved with that niche. We actually have, I happen to call him, I could be wrong, but he's definitely in the top group, top 5 if there's others out there. Tom Burns, who's with the Mesa Neighborhood Association, has really become the citizen expert on this. He's spent the last almost 12 years really working hard on this for his neighborhood and really become very knowledgeable and very engaged. And the Mesa has done a phenomenal job. Of course, they're one of the neighborhoods, they feel fairly vulnerable up where they are, and as we all know, had a fire really threaten them just a couple of years ago. And I can tell you that the work of the Neighborhood Association and Tom made a huge difference in the outcomes in the neighborhood. They knew how to act, they knew how to be the first responders. This is kind of a language that is getting the experts out of their silos. They kind of aren't sure, well, what's the role of a citizen? And Tom always says, well, we're the first responders because we're the ones there. You know, the experts and the emergency folks are there soon as soon as they can be. But in the meantime, what do I do? You know, you got a fire coming towards your neighbor's house, towards your house. So you're really the first responder. And he's done a great job of helping his neighborhood learn how to be effective first responders and also what they can do to protect their homes, what kind of materials they build them with and what kind of yards they have are some of the things that the average person can do. So with that, questions, comments, who wants to disagree with me? I'm used to that.
Can you talk a little bit about like the time frame that like is involved with getting engaged? Because I feel like a lot of times the engagement happens like almost too late in the process.
Process. I was going to put a whole page up on process. I would encourage anyone who feels strongly about wishing you could get involved earlier on to make that your focus. My personal opinion is none of our processes in this state, in any of the communities I've worked in, are right yet. And the city occasionally does a great job on comprehensive planning and involves people early enough on. But the actual decisions, I assume you're talking about the things that go through the hearing and all that. A hearing is way, way too late for anyone to think they're going to impact much. And hearings are unfortunately where we tend to become naysayers because we haven't been afforded an opportunity to affect anything prior to that. So what I can tell you is three things. One, work with your city and see if they can change their process. There's no legal barrier to having a different process, to moving it up earlier. And in fact, I worked with a group, I don't know, 15 years ago now probably, that tried really hard to change the city of Boise's process and get the neighborhood associations and or other affected people earlier on. And it was a group of developers, citizens, the neighborhood planner, and one of the city council members. So we were a diverse group of people that came up with this proposal. We didn't get anywhere with it, the city. I am still frustrated to this day. And we simply were saying that, you know, not every decision needs a big process. Some people just want to put new windows in their house or whatever. But planners know, or should know, because I can pretty much always tell you, what I call red flags. So a project comes in and they're looking at it, and they know if there's red flags. And to me, a red flag means, oh, people are going to be concerned about this. People aren't going to like this. And what are those red flags? And if there's enough of those, in my opinion, even one's enough, then the planner should say, okay, after you get through the initial meeting or two, so the early meetings with the developer really are about the developer just getting information. What can I do? What are the ordinances? What's the zoning? What if I want to do a CUP? So they're just getting that stuff. But sometimes shortly after that, what we recommended was that the planner facilitate, not organize, but just facilitate a meeting with everybody. Right now in Boise, it's up to the developer to reach out and have a neighborhood meeting. And some of them do it okay. Most of them kind of don't do it that well. And there's so much tension often at the very beginning. Neighbors don't really understand how to talk to developers. But I would encourage you to get to know developers. And when I was president of my neighborhood association, as soon as I knew about anything, sometimes you don't learn about it early enough, but as soon as I knew about anything, I'd be talking to the staff. They work for you. They're your staff. You can talk to them just like anybody else. You go in and ask them all kinds of questions. They're there to answer those questions for you. So get to know the staff and talk to the staff and ask them about this and that. And I always contacted the developer, whoever it was, and said, hey, I want to go have coffee and talk to you about this. That is a way you can try and get out front of that process, even though you're having to take the initiative on your own. There's usually at least, if it's a public hearing process, there's usually at least a month window, not always, but usually at least a month window. And with big projects, it's usually a little longer than that, where you can start meeting with those people and get a little more informed and analyze it from the perspective of the comp plan. Start looking at, going back to that question of, first, who can I work with? How can I participate? Where are my compromises? But then, what can I affect? So this developer is proposing X. What can I affect? And the way you answer that question is you go look at your plans. You go look at your comp plan. What's the comp plan say here? What is the language for the underlying zoning? Are they asking for variances? But I find the best way to understand what you can affect is to meet with the developer and say, here's what my neighborhood, I never would ever say to a developer, we just don't like this, we're not going to work with you. I always say, you're doing this, and here's some things that, kind of don't really like about it. Is there any wiggle room here? Are you open to some suggestions? The other thing I would do is I'd go and say, so here's some things we really like. And, we probably, if you think those are some things you can incorporate, we'd love to work with you. And, depending upon what you're willing to work with us on and what your compromises are, we'll support you. And developers, if they can hear from a neighborhood or advocates that they're going to actually have people stand up at the hearing and support what they're proposing, their ears really perk up a lot.
I think you gave an example of what is ineffective testimony here, so at a public hearing. Maybe you just answer my question, but what is an example of something that might be effective? Not necessarily for developers or whatever, but in swaying the opinions. I understand that it might be too late. It's too late if it's the first time you're at the hearing, but what would be effective?
Well,
For an example.
I've had success and failures. I recently had a success, which it's been a while, in Toronto at the city. And I would say the reason we were effective is emotion is rarely effective. Not, again, going back to my list of when the tactics make sense, but just took in some very reasonable, rational concerns and how what was being proposed didn't meet those concerns and wasn't addressing those concerns, and they were broad community concerns, and painted a picture of the fact that we would have liked to have, had more involvement, and had we probably could have reached. So being reasonable and proposing real legitimate concerns, and then calling out, this is where it can take time to, you don't have to become an expert, but it's helpful to find that niche and become a little bit of an expert in that area. So you can reference technical stuff, you can reference examples from other parts of the community. If they're saying we can't do this, and there's another place where they in fact did that, I would start with the staff and say, why not? But in front of the hearing, I would pose that as, we don't understand this. We've been told this can't be done, and yet we know it was done over in this other neighborhood, in this other space. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, thank you.
So growth, no one wants to take me on growth.
I don't want to disagree. You talked about farmland preservation, and I was wondering if there are any ideas in the valley that are happening and or that could have traction. I hear about in other cities. Cities might own farmland and rent it to the farmers, which is a way to control the cost of the farmland and to keep it in as part of open space the way parks are. But I was just wondering what is working here, what could work here?
Well, I would say one thing that is working here about as well as it can is I do think we have a pretty successful, effective land trust that's less focused on farmland. We don't have, frankly, a lot of success right now in this valley. I can talk about things that are working elsewhere. However, I will say that a good place to look might be too early to really see the outcomes yet, but the comprehensive planning effort that occurred in Canyon County fairly recently, and a really strong effort to realign and readjust their areas of impact and some of their policies to begin stopping the encroachment in Canyon County into their farmland. Tricia Nilsson is the planner over there, and she really led that, and she did a really good job. And I think we're going to find, she would know better and more specifically than I, the specific policy adjustments they made. But I know they made some fundamental ones. And they brought in property owners to, as well as citizens and all the stakeholders to work through these things. It's only been adopted maybe 3-4 years now, so that sometimes I know sometimes we get impatient as citizens with these changes because, things don't happen overnight. Because that's not what planning does. Planning doesn't change what happened yesterday or what's going to happen tomorrow, unfortunately. But you have to give it some time to see, and I think that's going to have some successful impact. I have a lot of ideas that I've thrown out there forever, and one of the ones I think adhering more closely, I've advocated for years that, so the Compass board is an interesting board. Most of us don't really understand it, but it's your elected officials. The majority of the Compass board is made up of representatives from the local governments. And yet those local officials never hear from us about any of the decisions they're making at Compass. But they make decisions every month at Compass. And I think it would be of value for them to realize that they have citizens in their community who are paying attention to both and looking at their decisions that they make in the city, all the land use decisions they make, and tracking whether or not they're really following Communities in Motion. Because Communities in Motion actually did a pretty good job as a plan of envisioning how we save farm, how we protect farmland, how we don't sprawl, how we improve our trees. The visions there are pretty good, actually. But we just don't follow them in practice. And I think we don't follow them in practice because we don't have citizens saying, well, what's going on? I personally think a great strategy would be to insist that your city council just adopt Communities in Motion. They could adopt it. They could force themselves to actually follow it. They don't. They tend to create these resolutions that kind of quasi-acknowledge it and imply they're going to follow it. And some of them try to better than others. But they don't just outright adopt it. They say, this is going to be a plan we are going to follow. And we're going to follow one of the things that we did the last time around that was phenomenal is it really went out and there's this land use data point called a TAZ, or a Transportation Analysis Zone, which is just a spot on the map that's a certain amount of acreage. And we debated how to get after where we want growth, what kind of growth. And we decided through the Communities in Motion process that we would use the TAZs, that they were the right size. So they're bigger than a census tract, they're smaller than anything else that we look at. And they're all over, and you can go and you can look, and every single TAZ in the 2 counties, they're all more or less the same size, has growth assigned or not. And we're not doing a very good job of following that. And if after we had adopted that, every city went out and actually adopted that growth scenario, we would look different today, even just in the however many years, 4 or 6 years since we adopted those. And you can, all the Compass's website's just a plethora of data. You can go find these, you can click on a TAZ and it'll tell you this many houses, this many jobs, some of them are none, which is where you have preservation of farmland and open space. So getting our electeds to actually honor, realize we want community emotion, we care about it, it matters to us, is one thing. Another thing are the tools. There are no, frankly, everyone struggles with this a little bit. We struggle with it, states like ours. There are very few regulatory tools available to local governments to be able to say yes and no. That's a statutory, we're very strong private property state. We don't really believe in telling people what they can or can't do with their property. And so that guides a lot of what communities do. And the legislature, that Land Use Planning Act that I talked about, when that was all created, they don't give the locals a lot of tools. So they're very limited what they can do. And sometimes when we're screaming and yelling at our mayor or our city council, it's probably one of those real ineffective times because you're probably asking them to do something that they legally can't do, or not do something that they legally can't, have no control over. So it's really important to understand that environment. But one of the tools that I think, I worked on something called the Open Space Advisory Committee for Ada County many years ago now. I think it's still a great document. The county hasn't used it much, but it was a great process. We spent about 1.5 years with a messy room full of 30 plus of us who had different perspectives and expertise. And there's some really good recommendations in there. One of them was to start really trying to look at something called transfer development rights. You can also do PDRs, which is a purchase of a development right. And those are tools that are available to us. So when you transfer a development right, you literally trade, you swap. So you have development rights over here and different development rights over here. And the ones over here maybe don't fit, the zoning happened. So I guess I should step back a little bit. So zoning, one of the things that's politically impossible to do in this state, it's not necessarily legally, but the few times it's been tried has been fought in court. It's virtually almost impossible to do something called downzoning. So every city and every county lives with all the decisions of their past. And so we have these places where you've got zoning that maybe a decision was made 3 years ago. And so what that zoning does is establish fundamental development rights on that land. And you can upzone it, and you could downzone it. Now, a person can downzone their own property. I could go to the city, well, I couldn't, my small little piece of ground. But if I own, a few acres somewhere, and I really wanted to protect and preserve, I could go to the city tomorrow or the county tomorrow and say, hey, I really want to downzone this. And they may or may not do that. But it's pretty hard for a local entity to do that, because they're going to get resistance and pushback politically and probably challenged in court. But so one of the things you can do, you find yourself in a situation where growth maybe hasn't happened quite the way people thought it would 15, 20, 30 years ago. So over here you got some development rights that maybe are a little fatter than you really want and need there. And over here maybe somebody really wants to do something and it'd be a good place. And so it's called transferring those development rights. And we trade this zoning over here that doesn't permit much or maybe sometimes nothing with this over here. And that's something that can be done. And purchasing development rights is another strategy where you go in and and this happens occasionally here, it is a tool that sometimes land trusts actually use, where the property owner has the property still, but you buy their development rights. It's kind of an interesting way to sort of create a down zone, essentially. So they no longer have development rights. You've paid them. And it works especially well for farmers, because a lot of farmers they don't really want to see their farms go away. They're farmers. They love farming and they love their land. But what they're finding is, the kids maybe don't want to take the family business on. And a new farmer, the new young farmer, can't afford to buy. So farmers, I learned this early on, they kind of sometimes refer to their land as their 401k. And when I first heard that, I was like, huh? And then someone explained it, so it makes sense. And that's just something you have to respect. I mean, that's a legitimate position for a farmer to have, frankly, in my opinion. What else are they going to do? So that's what a purchase of a development right can do. They can get their 401k out of their land through the purchase, and then the development rights go away, and now it's open land. And that might be enough for them. They might not get as much as they would if they sold it, so that's a personal choice. The problem with that is we don't have good funding mechanisms. We'd have to actually create and generate as a community if we wanted our counties and our cities to be doing this. But the transfer is more of a trade, and I think that they haven't been overly successful in the country except for where they're done regionally. And I really think that I've promoted to some of the entities here, if we all got together and quit thinking about how to do a TDR inside the city of Boise or just inside the city of Eagle, because there's just not enough options. Instead, look at it, I would love to see our next community in motion embrace TDRs from a regional perspective and identify places around the two counties where we like more growth and places where we don't, and can we create some regional memorandums of understanding that allow inter-jurisdictional development transfers and trades, which happen in some places, they do happen. So those are some ideas. It's a tough one. It's one we need to fix.
So one way to plug into that kind of farmland preservation is to find a trust that's looking for investors. And there's an example of that at IroquoisValleyFarms.com. And they loan money to organic farmers to preserve or expand their farmland. So I had a question sort of out of left field, had to do with YIMBY and NIMBY.
Okay.
I know it's kind of weird in this session, but I just thought, it'd be helpful because I find that those two terms have become pretty squishy. And, we can use the term NIMBY, or we often do, or people use that term to kind of characterize folks that are opposed to whatever we want. And those people might be opposed to, a chemical plant going next to a watershed or a wetlands or a river. So they might be trying to protect a habitat or a water source. Or it could be used, for people who are opposing a housing development that's for low-income folks and maybe people of color or diverse, kind of populations. So that term can be used for both to sort of characterize them as being against, sort of anti-whatever. And by the same token, what I'm seeing is the YIMBY label can be used to describe folks that are saying, yeah, welcoming, diverse populations into a neighborhood or, affordable housing or whatever, or positive things. But it can also be co-opted by folks that are pro-growth at all costs and want to sort of take on that mantle of YIMBY to sort of say, oh, we're on the right side of everything. Can you talk about that a little bit, short, briefly? I don't want to take up a lot of time.
Sure. Well, that's why I didn't, even though that was in your title, because that's kind of how this topic evolved initially.
So it's a bait and switch, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So I chose they're squishy, and I think they can work both ways. And so that's why I tried to talk about, if you're advocating for it purely out of self-interest, and you haven't looked at the big picture, you're probably not looking at it right. I mean, I can't say for sure. Doesn't mean your self-interest isn't sometimes in the right place, in the right time, absolutely the right thing. But if you haven't asked yourself those questions, you're probably either NIMBY or YIMBY for the wrong reasons. And, you know, I guess to me, the terminology for that very reason is why I stay away from it. I mean, to me, anytime you're saying no, just no, it's just not constructive, in my opinion. Now, no, because, and you've looked at the big picture, so like the gas plant as a neighbor. So, you know, that's why I showed the principles and all these other things. If you reviewed it and analyzed it, that's not context appropriate. That challenges many of our principles. So you're looking at the broader picture. Hopefully we don't have too many more places in our two-county area here. There are some other communities who still challenge this. And we had this, I think a lot of it's been cleaned up in the last 15, 20 years, where we had houses growing up next to industrial. And that's a problem. But whose problem is it? Does that mean you now have to push out the industrial people who, you know, we all need industry, we all use stuff. We need freight, we need these things, because we all use stuff. And sometimes we forget that.
Stay near the mic.
Oh, I'm
Otherwise,
sorry.
nobody can hear you.
Are they still on? I thought they weren't. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So, you know, I just think it's really important to stay away from those entirely and make sure that you're thinking about the big picture and not just your self-interest. It's okay to think about your self-interest too, but it's not, in my opinion, constructive to just think about it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Kind of an extreme example of that, I think, would be what we've seen with the pipeline, on both sides of that. And in fact, I agree with what you're saying. As soon as it's like calling somebody a racist and then trying to have a conversation with them. You can't do it. As soon as you call somebody a NIMBY, that's the end of the conversation because you've already characterized that person and put them in a box.
The same as soon as you called a developer greedy.
Yeah.
Which I hear a lot.
And Eric is, and you're correct about YIMBY too, where the YIMBY groups have been most active is their pro-development stance has been, as Eric called it, co-opted into a belief that they're just pro-development without a quality underpinning their advocacy. And so that's really important too. One of the things I think is important to just commentary on the process at the city of Boise. Basically, you have 2 minutes to say whatever you're going to say to the city planning commission or the city council or whoever's hearing whatever it is. And then there's also establishing standing. So if you're not involved in that, participating early in the process and in the planning commission hearings, when it goes before city council, you have no standing. You're not going to be heard at that point. So
that's only under an appeal situation, actually.
yeah, whatever it is, it's so constrained that unless you're teaming with somebody with little pieces of the message, nobody's going to hear the whole message that you might want to get out there as a group. Along those lines, you had some suggestions for improvements to the process in Boise. Can you think of a community that has what you think of as an ideal process that the city of Boise should adopt in terms of their how they introduce projects in the community and how the community is allowed to react to them?
I can't. You have to, because I, you know, I mostly do this stuff here. I have heard of a few from planners over the years who've come from other communities that, where they have better city-led processes on The idea of that red flag and that early meeting that I was talking about is if you can get out front of the application. So once you have an application, so whoever's proposing, you know, the multifamily home or whatever it is, the apartment, or once you have an application, now everything's very constrained. It's now moved into kind of a little bit of a legal realm. They can make changes, which is, I would say, even after an application, talking to them, staff is going to comment on that application and decide what they're going to decide and what they're going to recommend. But the application, so the real goal is to get before the application, before any of those decisions that they make. And that can be hard, but you don't know what's coming.
Can you maybe use the booth home example as a way that the neighborhood get out in front of NIMBY reaction?
Sure, a little bit. So everybody knows about the Booth home in the north end of Boise, and some of you might not. So it's a facility that's been there since 1901 or something, a very, very long time. And it was a very unique, unusual infill house. It was a whole block in the north end, smack dab right in the middle of the north end, that had a home, it had a history, but the short version is essentially a home for unwed mothers and allowed them to continue their education and their schooling. Because at one point in time, they weren't allowed to go to school. And then even over time, that shifted and changed over time how it was used. But the Salvation Army ran it most recently for, I don't know how many years. Before that, it wasn't them. But, and it served a really great purpose in our community, but for a whole host of reasons. The Salvation Army really needed to move. They're going to continue, actually, this service, very valuable service in our community. And what it's evolved into today, obviously, you know, unwed mothers can go to high school and finish high school if they choose. But what they need are other kinds of support. And often they, you know, they're going through something most of their peers aren't, and they might feel uncomfortable or awkward in their own world. And so it's a place of support, it's a place of other education, parenting education, and you know, they're about to become parents. So they really want to grow it. And the facility, you heard how old it was. One building's out old, a couple others are newer, but they were, you know, not falling down, but they needed a lot of work, and they really couldn't grow it in that location. And more importantly, they really wanted to centralize it to the communities, the valley's population, because they really serve, it's really a regional facility. They serve, I would imagine, all the way to even Ontario, not home. I don't know that for a fact, but, you know, so they wanted to move. So they were able to get a location where they're going to build a new facility. They've been spending quite a bit of time trying to raise those dollars and build a much newer, more state-of-the-art, better place that has both, so they provide both services to some of the young women live there and some don't. So they have both those services, and they pretty much had to get rid of all their living dwelling. They had a little bit. So they'd like to grow that again for those who need it. But they especially wanted to be able to serve, they turned people away. So they were going to sell this piece of ground. And it was very controversial. The neighborhood, as you can imagine, was kind of concerned. It's a whole block right in the middle of North End, and what was going to happen there. So the North End Neighborhood Association, to their credit, they got out in front of this. They could have gotten further out in front of it, and they tried, and for a variety of reasons didn't. And they ended up actually hiring us to run a visioning process. And their purpose at the end of the day was they wanted some clarity around what the neighborhood wanted, didn't want, could tolerate there, so that they could do a reasonable job of advocating in front of the city regarding whatever came forward. They were hoping, and this is the piece they didn't get out in front of enough. Originally, they were hoping to get this in place so they then could use it to maybe actually encourage the kind of developer they wanted to come in and develop it. And I think they could have maybe even been successful with that, but they would have needed to start a good half a year earlier. But it did give the board a good sense of confidence, and I think it probably at the end of the day we opened it up to developers. A couple participated, not very many. They tend to be kind of reluctant, although we did meet and talk to some of them separately. And we worked pretty closely with the listing agent, and kind of was keeping them informed and letting them know, what we were hearing and learning from the community, because we figured they were in a good position. Because at the end of the day, one of the leverage points, so when I talk about what can you impact, so one of the key leverage points that I learned through this process that I thought was important for the neighborhood to know and understand was Salvation Army really, they wanted to get as much as they could for it because they were going to use whatever money they got from selling this property to help fund this new facility. But as important, if not frankly almost more important, was they really wanted to get a proposal that they knew would survive. And what I mean by that is they were not interested in someone who was going to come in with such a far out idea that they were going to go through the process and then not get approval at City Hall and then not buy the land. Because that's when you're doing a big deal like that, that's pretty much something you always write into. It's like, we're going to buy this providing we can get approval for what we want to do. So it's an automatic, the whole deal goes away. And the last thing the Salvation Army wanted was to have it come back in their lap. Because they're kind of on a time frame. They really want to make this happen. And they had already kind of decided they were willing to take a little less money or however much less money for something that was more certain. They were pretty confident this project was going to. And so I think that Nina doing that and having had this kind of a quasi-charrette visioning process that we did, I think it helped Salvation Army also feel more comfortable and confident in the choice they made, that, okay, this is something that the neighborhood's going to be okay with. There were people who wanted more and people who wanted less. I mean, there was differing opinions, but in general, the final thing that the purchaser or the developer or what they were proposing fit, okay within what people had envisioned there. So that was getting out front a little bit. We have helped communities with a few other things like that.
What are they actually building there? I guess
they're proposing only residential, which was kind of the main preference. There were people who were hoping for maybe a tiny bit of mixed use. They are preserving the original building, which is also another real high level preference. The other buildings were not as valued by the community. The historic preservation community will tell you they're valuable for different reasons, but so they're preserving, so they got preservation of the main building, the original building, which is a desire. They got some protection for some of the trees. It's beautifully landscaped. It's got a very healthy, mature tree. So they kind of, all these people who have lived across the street from this all these years, basically a park across the street. So they're getting, I'm trying to remember, I think the main building's going to be converted to condos, the last I saw. I haven't tracked it. And then they're just going to do some single-family housing or townhomes, I can't remember which it was, around the block. So it's all housing, and so that they're getting a little bit more density with the condos, but not much more. It won't be too different from what they already have. But some more housing, and then I'm done for YIMBY, so that'll be good. Questions, comments? This big topic, I don't know if I satisfied what you were looking for from tonight. I hope I gave you a little bit of something, something I could talk about forever. I'm happy if anyone is in the middle of a challenge or frustrating situation or question, feel free to contact our office anytime. We really do like to help, and preferably earlier than later. We have developers call us, we have citizens call us, we have communities call us.
So would Idaho Smart Growth come to, like if our neighborhood had a meeting at the elementary school, usually this happens when the developer is already presented, everyone's rallied up, they go, you know, it's just a gripe fest, okay? It's not productive in my opinion. And I get very frustrated because most people are completely unaware of the laws. They don't understand that the mayor is not listening and can't do anything about it, you sometimes can't. So do you ever do any sort of like a 3-page in a nutshell, here's the basics to understand how your government is working under to educate the common citizen so that they can be more productive in how they respond instead of just screaming and yelling at planning and zoning and, you know, getting upset and feeling like they're not affecting the process because they're not, because they don't know how.
Yeah, no, I've done one-on-ones, we've done one-on-ones on transportation, on land use, or private thing ones we've done, absolutely. The other thing, I always joke and say, if someone would pay me to just represent developers in front of neighborhood associations, I would do that for a living. Because I actually do that pretty well, I know those worlds really well, and you're right, it really is unfortunate. And unfortunately, developers kind of their own worst enemy at times. They don't know how to do that, and they don't hire someone like me. I'm not suggesting it has to be me, but someone like me. And so, they're frankly, majority of them are kind of timid towards. You don't realize it, but because I've had many of them tell me that. When I was president, I was meeting with a lot of. Sometimes it was just a couple houses, sometimes there, but you know, probably monthly I'd meet with 3 or 4 different developers, and I'd get done with a conversation, and they'd go, "Well, that was really nice." And I'd be like, "What do you mean?" They're like, "Well, I was really afraid to come talk to you," and I'm like, "Why were you afraid?" So I think it's helpful for citizens to appreciate that developers don't have, and that's what I meant about assumptions. They rarely are who we assume they are. They
It's almost like they need a representative.
Some
That's
of
what
them,
you're saying.
some of them, frankly, are, you know, they have their attitudes and their opinions and they're gonna do what they're gonna do and they really don't care what other people think.
Yeah.
But that's the few, I mean, that's true of anybody. I mean, there's citizens like that, there's frankly electeds like that, there's, you know, but they're always the few. And for the most part, you know, if you're reasonable, they'll be reasonable. And I think the process, and that's why this proposal that came forward, we had 3 developers involved with that group. They really supported it too, because they recognize the process doesn't work for them any better than it works for us. And the last thing anybody wants is to appeal and have to do it over again. And that just costs them time and money. It really is not something they like.
So one thing I think is important, you know, is to get beyond what you're against and do some research, look at different models of development types, you know, whether it's commercial, retail, housing, you know, find out what you like and see what would fit in your neighborhood and get people together to say, here's what we want, this is what we would support, and then present that to your local leadership, local developers, and give them an idea of what would cause you to show up at a meeting in support of something. And you know, it may mean, you know, that they need to think a little bit differently about their approach. You know, a case in point was the community conversation. You know, all three scenarios were 100 units, and you know, what I would like to see is a 4th one that was, you know, let's have a whole bunch of like small middle, kind of missing middle housing, you know, 4 to 19 units, you know, that are more neighborhood and human scale.